Hi, I'm Steve Blumenthal. I have lived in Lexington now for 25 years, and I'm delighted to participate in this remembrance of World War I. I'm here to talk about my grandfather, Sam Stitzberg, who was my mother's father, and he served in World War I in the AEF, the American Expeditionary Force in France, and I'll tell you a little bit about his life. My grandfather was born in Milwaukee, Wisconsin in 1892. My grandfather was the third of 6 children that they had, and at a very young age, I believe when he was in elementary school, the family moved to Chicago, and they lived on the near west side of Chicago, which at that, this was an area known as Maxwell Street, and it's kind of the equivalent of the Lower East Side in New York. It was pretty much an all-Jewish neighborhood, and it was filled with a lot of immigrants from places like Russia and other Eastern European countries at that time. So I don't know a lot about my grandfather in going to school, whether he finished all the way through high school or not. I believe he did, but I have no evidence of that. And I really don't know what he did prior to the war. In 1918, he was 26 years old, or he would be 26 years old. I really hadn't known a lot that he was even in the war. I believe it was something that had been mentioned while my parents were alive. But I really found out about his involvement in World War I after my father passed away 2 years ago. As I was cleaning out my father's house in Florida, I came upon a box in his closet that had a lot of things from my father's service in World War II, and in that I found a Ziploc bag that my father had saved. My mother passed away 20 years ago. So he had saved it from his father-in-law, and it contained a number of artifacts and documents and maps, all of his medals and things from my grandfather, Sam Stitzberg, from my father's father-in-law. And I was surprised to find this, and I went through it, and I've gotten somewhat interested in genealogy recently, so I had been doing a little bit of research on various branches of my family, and in particular on my mother's side, I've learned a little bit more about the Stitzberg. Stitzberg is a fairly rare name. It's not a common name, and generally the people that I found in the internet is wonderful for this, but generally the people that I found on the internet are people that are related to me. So, and they tend to either be in Milwaukee or Chicago. So that's been helpful. So my grandfather, from what I could tell from among the documents that I found his induction notice and the date that he was told to report. My grandfather was drafted, I believe, and inducted into the Army on June 26, 1918, in Chicago, Illinois. He started out as a private, although eventually he was promoted to a private first class. And he did have a younger brother, Harvey Stitzberg, who was a corporal and also in the Army in France. I don't know much at all about his brother's service. I found in this bag his pay book, which contained the dates that he was paid and how much he was paid and how much was taken out for insurance. And from that, it says that he arrived in France on August 22nd, 1918, and that gave him a bump in pay, which I noticed. And when he arrived, he was assigned to the C Company of the 319th Infantry Regiment in the 80th Division, which was known as the Blue Ridge Division. And the 80th Division, I've done some other research on the internet. There's a lot of material on the 80th Division, and in particular, remembrances of it. They had a magazine that they published. The 80th Division was brought into existence just prior to World War I. It was disbanded in 1919 or taken out of service, and then it was reconstituted in World War II. So there's quite a bit about the exploits and the story of the 80th Division, and from that is what I'm going to base what I think my grandfather may have gone through. The 80th Division was, and there's a roster of the 80th Division in one of the magazines that was published, I believe, or printed in 1919 or 1920. In that, it looks like most of the men that were in the 80th Division were either from western Pennsylvania, the area in Pittsburgh or around Pittsburgh, West Virginia, and eastern Ohio. So my grandfather, and there were people from other parts of the country, but not a lot. When I look through it, there's just, his commanding officer, I believe, was from North or South Dakota when you look in the roster. But there wasn't like all people from Chicago that he knew. So while he was in the 319th Regiment in the 80th Division, he fought and was involved in the Meuse-Argonne campaign, the Meuse-Argonne offensive. And this was the major battle that the United States, that General Pershing and the AEF was involved in the war. There was a small, narrow region of the front that was the American sector, and I can tell from the story of the 80th Division and from maps that I found online that the 80th Division was assigned a section of the American sector. And interestingly enough, the 80th Division's section, so the Battle of the Meuse-Argonne started on September 26th, 1918, and basically they pushed the Germans out of a narrow area along the Meuse River, between the Meuse River and the Argonne Forest. This narrow, actually a kind of a triangular strip of land. They pushed them across the Meuse River and further back out of France and further back towards Germany. And the 80th Division was in action from the September 26th until approximately November 6th. So I don't have any stories or any details of what my grandfather did. I certainly didn't talk to him. My grandfather, I didn't say this at the beginning, but my grandfather was born in 1892 and he died in 1959 at the age of 67, I believe. And I was born in 1953, and so I was 6 years old when he died. And he didn't live in Chicago at that point. So I only saw him a few times, but I was 6 or younger. Anyway, from the evidence of the 80th Division data and from some of the things that I found in this bag from my grandfather, he stayed on in France until May of 1919, so quite a ways longer. And I believe he was in France. He wasn't, nothing that I found in the bag or in the story of the 80th Division indicates that they were in Germany as part of the occupying force. He has maps of Paris in the bag and some addresses written on the back. And he has a postcard that he wrote to one of his younger sisters on March 8th, 1919, saying that I'm hoping to be home soon, and we're having, basically it sounded like we're having a good time in France. And I found a photo of him, and on the back of the photo it said, this picture was taken in Le Mans, city in France, which is actually quite far away. It's northwest of Paris. And it says, this was taken just before we went out to the theater. So, I think I think that he had some pretty interesting experiences in France. But this postcard, there's no other letters, there's no other documents of anything that he wrote home to the family. It's just this postcard to this younger married sister, and her name was Esther Levy at that point. And the thing that I had found through my genealogical I didn't even know that he had a sister named Esther, because she wasn't alive when I was living. Turns out, but I did find her in some of my internet and geological searches, and I figured out that she was a sister because her maiden name was Stitzberg, and in her death notice it said that her father was Peter Stitzberg, who was my great-grandfather, and that she had an older sister, Sophie, who I knew was my aunt, and that she had two brothers, Sam and Harvey, who were serving with the AEF. She died in April 1st, 1919. So while my grandfather was in France, she passed away. No idea what I found the death notice for her, and I have no idea what she died from. It could have been from childbirth, could have been from influenza, or it could have been something else. But I did found this death notice through Google, and eventually when I was with my sister, I have one sibling, my sister, who lives in Israel. When my sister and I were in Chicago a year ago, we visited some of the cemeteries where our ancestors are buried, and we actually found the grave of this aunt, this Esther Levy. So that's kind of the story of what I know about my grandfather's service in World War I. Afterwards, my grandfather went back to Chicago. I think he met my grandmother. Her name was May Gerber, and they got married in the early 1920s and moved out of that neighborhood on the west side of Chicago. They moved to a new neighborhood that was just being created on the far north side of Chicago called Rogers Park. It's right along the lake, right just south of where Evanston starts. So it's at the very far northern end of Chicago. And they lived in an apartment in Rogers Park. My mother was born in 1925, and her younger sister was born in 1927. My grandfather was a wholesale distributor of women's and children's clothes to stores that were in small towns around Chicago, in Indiana, Illinois, and Wisconsin. And I think he spent a lot of time traveling with samples to these stores and selling these stores with the clothes. He had an office, my mother told me, in the Merchandise Mart, which is a very large, at the time it was the largest building in the world before the Pentagon was built. He may have owned this business. I don't know for a fact that he did or not, but he turned it over to my Uncle Seymour Stern, who was my Aunt Lois's, my mother's sister's husband. So my uncle took over the business when my grandfather retired. My grandfather retired probably around 1950 or 51 when my parents got married, and my aunt also got married around that time, and he no longer had to be worried about them, and he remarried to a woman named Rose Mendelson, and they moved to Albuquerque, New Mexico in the early 1950s, where his younger brother, Harvey Stitzberg, the one that had been a corporal in the Army, had already moved and had been living there since the 1940. And so I didn't see my grandfather a lot, in the time that we overlapped. So the last thing but I do have some recollections of him, because Unlike my other grandparents who lived a couple of miles away from us or a mile away from us, we would see them every weekend. And, we're constantly doing stuff with them. This grandfather, my mother's father, I only saw a few times. And, some of that I was very, very young. But to me, coming from a place like Albuquerque, New Mexico, he really always seemed exotic. And there were a number of things about him that I found kind of, and in thinking back on him, that I found kind of intriguing. First of all, I was a little kid. He would come in, and my father on the train, and in particular, he came in on the Santa Fe flagship train, the Super Chief, which was a big deal back then in the 1950s. And my father and I would go down to Union Station to meet the train and to pick him up. And that was, for a 5 or 6 year old, 4 or 5 or 6 year old kid, that sticks in my mind. I can still remember standing on that platform and watching this Santa Fe Super Chief coming into Union Station. And then my grandfather either brought us or sent presents. And they all tended to be things of the Southwest. Indian headdress, cowboy hats, cowboy boots, or I remember a pair of toy Colt 45 guns. And this was kind of exotic for me back then. The other thing that was, my grandfather really loved Chinese food. And when he would come, we tended to go out more often. And in particular, when he visited, we would go to a very well-known Chinese restaurant on the south side of Chicago called Chi-Am's. And it was very famous. My grandfather called it Chaim's, which is a Hebrew word for life. And I still remember his saying about the tea, even to this day. He said the tea came in cups without handles in the Chinese restaurants, because if it was too hot to touch, it was too hot to drink. And that line has just stuck in my mind. The last exotic thing about my grandfather was, which I have very, very fond memories of, was when I was very young, we lived in the top floor of a walk-up apartment building in Chicago. And my mother and my sister were very fortunate that we would be able to, my grandfather owned a house in Michigan on the lake, across the lake from Chicago. And my mother and my sister and I spent our summers at this house. It was up on a sand dune, pretty high up, right across a street from the beach. And my father would come out and join us on the weekends, and he would take maybe a couple of week vacation. And I remember when he took his vacation, he was busy working on fixing things on the house. And my grandfather would come out maybe in the summer from Albuquerque and would be with us. But we would have lots of visitors would come for a week. But my mother and I would be out there for the whole summer, and floating around on Lake Michigan, on inner tubes. I just have great memories of that. And this house was a wonderful house. And I was able to dig back through some of the pictures that my father had to find a picture of the house. In fact, my wife and I and daughter and son visited the house a few years ago. And it's still there, and the family that's living there and owns it let us go inside and look around. I went up to my old room, looked in the window seat that opened up to see if any of my toys were still there, and they weren't. So that's kind of the recollections that I have of this grandfather. And I don't know much other than what I found in this set of artifacts that he left behind from when he was in the Army in World War I.